We're going to dig into discourses, literacies, and learning some more. And as part of this larger arc of the second module, following this, we'll explore new literacies, and then after that, an example of a way of teaching literacies. And then finally, at the end of the module, we'll step back and try to apply what we're learning about literacies and discourse to current scientific understandings of how learning happens and what that might imply for the redesign of schools to support diverse groups of learners. So you've begun to explore and better understand the importance of primary discourses and secondary discourses, especially for opportunities to learn and access forms of knowledge in school and in the world. And in a moment, we're going to look at a real-world example of primary discourses and secondary discourses meeting in school. And it comes from a seminal study, but it was conducted over 40 years ago. Now, on this page, I pictured two young boys, and they're engaging in a certain activity together. They are engaging in a literacy activity where the older child is reading an illustrated book to the younger child as the younger child close and looks along at the pictures. Whereas the older child is reading the print and looking at the pictures, the younger child is feeling very much included in the core of this activity. This book happens to be about how dragons love tacos, but not spicy salsa. So it's really important that when you invite dragons over to your house and throw them a taco party, that you don't include any spicy salsa, because if you do, the dragons will get the tummy troubles, and when dragons get the tummy troubles, they're liable to breathe fire and burn your house down. Now this, of course, is a very fanciful fictional tale. It's a type of text, and the reading of this type of text and the sharing of it and the laughing about it and talking about it, and then later on making up new stories about it and drawing pictures about it, those are all literacy-rich activities, but they're not necessarily something that is going to happen everywhere or in every case. And it's also not the only necessary type of literacy activity. So we're going to look at some conclusions drawn from a study that was conducted over 40 years ago. This was a real close study involving participant observation, where she spent a lot of time observing children and families in their homes and communities, and then also in the school to which they all attended. And there are three communities that she studied, all in the Carolinas. And she studied three main groups. One of them were children from a pseudonym Rhodeville. Another group was children from Tracton. And the third group were children from Main Street, or Maintown. And so we'll look at the conclusions drawn from the study about the literacy types of experiences, emphases, and across these three groups. And in Maintown, these were families and children from families that were middle class and part of a professional community. It's really important to know that these were black families and white families. Whereas in Rhodeville, these were white working class families, members of a mill community, a sawmill community. And then Tracton was a black working class community. So while Rhodeville was predominantly white and Tracton was predominantly black, Maintown was both black and white. So in Maintown, what she found in her observations was that children were surrounded by artifacts of literacy, books and other types. And when children were read to, there was an emphasis on connecting the text to their lives, to asking questions, and to extending and applying the text. Children in Maintown from both black and white communities engaged in writing creatively and imaginatively. They were encouraged to do that by their family members, parents in particular, as well as other caregivers. And the kinds of home literacy activities they engaged in really mimicked the school literacy activities that students encountered in their classrooms. And so characterizing the literacy environment of Maintown, the ecology in which the children in Maintown grew up, black children and white children, is that they learned to use literacy and how to be students, okay? But in Rhodeville, which was a white working class sawmill community, the children were also surrounded by artifacts of literacy. They were typically different texts and other different artifacts, but they were in the surround, in that ecology. Children were read to, but with very different emphases, and this is really significant. For them, the emphasis was on vocabulary and sounds, on interpreting things as either literal and factual. They were encouraged to retell what they had heard, and the text is treated as an authority. The dominant text for a lot of this instruction was the Bible, the Old and New Testament, within many Christian traditions. The writing that was encouraged in this community was formulaic, thank you cards, grocery lists. And the home literacy was really disconnected from their other home activities. And what we're able to conclude about this environment is that the students from Rhodeville learned about tools of literacy. And then in the community of Tracton, which was a black working class community, the children were surrounded by many environmental artifacts, but not many of them were books. The children were not read to by adults, not typically, but there was an emphasis on oral storytelling as a way of building community, of solving problems, and of distinguishing oneself. There's a lot of interaction and engagement around talk and storytelling included in that, in addition to a lot of wordplay and language play. Writing was used as a substitute for vocal engagement only when it was needed. Verbal, face-to-face, connected communication was really more typical and preferred. And home literacy was integrated fully with these oral language traditions without a real explicit effort and without real direct instruction about how to read or how to write. And so the literacy environment of Tracton really supported children to learn how to be members of that community. And so if you think about these three communities of children and families that all attended school in the same district. They grew up with different primary discourses and in different literacy environments, some of which fit into the ways that school had been designed better than others, because schools typically have been designed by middle-class professional people, and in our country, middle-class professional white people. So what do you do with all this discourse stuff? Think about how discourses are ways of being and ways of making sense of the world. So the way you learn how to do that is going to be a function of the environment you grow up in. Reading, writing, speaking, and thinking means doing that in particular ways that allow you to get things done that are valued in your community. To acquire discourse, people must have opportunities to do what is valued in the discourse. People require practice, and as they practice their discourse more and more, they need to see how competent others perform these practices, and then they also need support and challenges to increase their own capacities to use the discourse. So part of what this course is about learning how to think deeply about what knowledge is needed in order to explore concepts and disciplinary texts in your subject areas. And then how to teach students how to do that. And it turns out a lot of knowledge is needed in order to comprehend disciplinary texts. But the good news also is that we also build more knowledge as we read those texts. So as you think about supporting your students' entry into secondary discourses, consider how this depends on the symmetry between, for all of us, our primary discourse and the secondary discourse we are entering. The symmetry between those secondary discourses we have already mastered and those we are entering. The symmetry between those secondary courses we have already developed competency in and those we are entering. The nature of the relationships we develop and the recognition given our other discourses by the new secondary discourse we are entering. And this is especially the case in schools where there's an official discourse as well as disciplinary discourses. And the adults who guide students in their entry into new secondary discourses will communicate a lot to students and what they believe about students' primary discourses and already acquired secondary discourses. Think about is how children from Maintown, Roadville, and Tracton might have experienced entry into the many different secondary discourses of school based on whether or not the literacy environments in which they grew up had sort of near or far resemblance to the school discourses. Which brings me to the reflection question I'll want you to respond to for this module part. How do the examples of Maintown, Roadville, and Tracton help you think more about the relationships among primary and secondary discourses? But before you write that reflection, I want to make an important conjecture. And that is that we can design classroom environments in ways that apprentice students from multiple and diverse primary and secondary discourses into the discourses of our disciplines. And in fact, that's our job. And that's what we'll be working on this course.